than me.
All right.
It
Go
says
ahead.
we're live.
Yeah, lies.
So today we are brought to you by King Harv's Imperial Coffees. Tell him we sent you. And yeah, the Cameroon, surprisingly dark and rich.
I like
That was what we
African
were
coffees.
drinking for Sunday breakfast.
I like African coffees.
Well, I got all my geisha at the VolsCon, so
Oh,
Well, this was mine. 'Cause that Cameroon was the free half pound of my last order.
oh, okay.
So, another supporter of ours, and we support him right back, tinyurl.com/among the leaves tees, snarky t-shirts with witty sayings and pure silliness.
Yeah.
You need more silly in your life, don't you? Yes, you do. And finally, last but not least, keep the
Air conditioning.
air conditioning on today. Right, that's what we need. Ko-fi.com/blanket fort. This helps defray some of the costs attendant in keeping us comfortable in Texas.
Yes, which is necessary.
Because today it's 80-ish and
Yeah.
rising.
Going further and further up.
Yes.
litigation.
I was out in the garden earlier, and there's a reason my hair's wet, because I wasn't going to inflict garden sweat on y'all. Sorry.
And the reason Cedar is on camera today is because of our special guest, Dave Freer, who we did not get up that early. It's actually morning down there.
Oh, really?
Morning there, afternoon here.
Yeah.
Spring here, fall there.
Yeah.
Autumn there.
Well,
Is it
actually,
spring?
it's spring there.
No, it's autumn.
Or, yeah, it's autumn. That's right. Yeah.
Reversed.
Reversed.
We're in Texas. It's
So.
spring.
Anyway, I'm going to shut up and add Dave back.
Hello,
So,
Dave.
welcome, Dave Freer.
Hello, Dave.
Good morning. I always wave at my grandchildren, so I'll wave at you lot.
And we'll wave back. I think it's an
Uh,
instinct. When you see people, you wave at them.
Yeah.
Sometimes with all your fingers.
Yeah.
I was
Well,
going to say, my wife's phrase is usually pick a finger.
I like that.
Here in Texas, when you come up to an intersection and you see somebody else, there's let me get my hands right. There's a 2-finger wave. You lift 2 fingers off the wheel, and that's your wave of
Yeah.
acknowledging that there's somebody there.
Yeah.
Because
Right,
if you only lifted one, it could be misconstrued.
Of course, the other thing you immediately do after that's like, come on, go.
Get out of the way. Holding up.
We're slightly different. I mean, it's quite a large island, about the size of Barbados, and there are 1,000 people. And so, yes, you always wave at every car.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you don't wave at somebody, they're liable to turn around and drive after you and ask you if you're all right.
Or why you're pissed off at them.
Exactly.
Well, Dave, you have quite a history. Originally from South Africa, along with our friend
Peter Grant.
Peter Grant, who is also a native South African who is now a U.S. citizen. You're now an Australian citizen.
Yes. Australia didn't know anything. So obviously, here I am.
Yeah. You both served time in the military, and you're both writers.
Yep.
And
I don't have Peter's talent, but other than that, yes.
excuse
sorry.
me.
I beg to
we
differ.
will all argue with you on that.
I beg to differ.
Not that we're saying that Peter isn't a talented writer, but Dave, you are. I have been a fan of yours for more than 20 years now. You are an excellent writer, and I'm very excited that we're getting to work with you with Rack Control Press.
If my
Bit of
head
fast-
got any bigger, I wouldn't be able to get out the door. Please stop flattering me.
Well, your styles are entirely different.
Yes, there is that.
And a lot of people are loving your beard, including Wally, who,
Has a magnificent beard himself.
yeah, but it's nothing compared to Dave's.
Uh.
So your first published novel was in 1999, correct?
Correct, yeah. I actually wrote it 3 years before that. It took that long to get through traditional publishing. And I submitted to the slush pile. And yeah, Pam Upton was one of the slush readers at the time, and she says she picked it up But yeah, there were 3,000 submissions, and they bought one. So I feel I got lucky that time.
Well, you've actually gotten lucky more than once, or good, depending on
Yes,
how
I
you
got-
want to look at it.
Yes. I kind of never feel I've really got good, because if I felt I'd got good, I'd stop trying.
Yeah.
It's one of my wife's sort of things about meals I prepare. If she discovered, if she said this was the best thing ever, I said, right, okay, I've done that. I can move on now.
Well, I think if you're an author, you by nature suffer from imposter syndrome.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think we always want to do better. I mean, I can write something that I'm happy with, but I can also want to improve it, because there's so much room to explore and play in fiction.
And I always have this story and how should we say, these images in my head, because I tend to see my stories at the same time as write them. And I can never, ever manage to get the words to do as good a job as the image in my head.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Terribly frustrating.
Yeah.
Now, you also won the Prometheus Award last year for Cloud Castles.
Yeah, I was really so pleased about that, simply because I think the Prometheus is such a wonderful award and tends to pick such great books. And I mean, that's after all how awards really work.
Yeah.
It's not for the imposter at the moment, like me. It's they have to have chosen lots of great books in the past, and then continue to choose great books in the future, so that they don't notice that they slipped up and let yours in.
And you also beat out two friends of ours last year, John Van Stry and Carl Gallagher.
Oh, well done.
That does seem unfair when you like all the other people involved in the process. But I guess somebody had to be lucky that time around. And obviously they like more people like mine slightly more. I'm sure there was never much in it.
I think the Prometheus is one of the awards that still has some weight to it,
Yes.
because a lot of the awards that use the ranked choice voting, because we just had long conversations about that with Ben Yallow, it's that leads to, and being Australian now, you are aware of this, it leads to the middle of the road picks. Whereas awards that are based on merit are more likely to find the books that are really, really wonderful.
Yeah, the description of the Australian political system is it finally ends up electing the political party that everyone doesn't hate as much as the others.
That's exactly what Ben said.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
He said it's either, he told us the other night, it was either the best one or the one that everybody least disliked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Given our politicians, I think it's least disliked. And it's a tough choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think another issue was a
Looking
Prometheus.
at you guys and feeling terribly envious. At least you have some choices. I mean, it's very hard to tell the difference between our left and right here. They both seem to support exactly the same things.
Yeah.
And
which is what you would get with the ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think with Prometheus is the fact that the novels that they choose are actually novels that people have read.
Which is kind of nice.
That's a shock to some people.
Yeah.
That is a big shock to some people. Yeah.
Kermit, we're actually live. So if you have a question, feel free.
We have a live chat. I don't know if you can see it, Dave, but
We're on the side. I see it.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll occasionally answer questions there.
Listen, you're getting me to do one thing at once. Getting me to do two things at once is usually fraught with disaster.
So, Dave, I'd like to go back. You said that if you ever get good at something, you never do it again.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I'm an
Okay.
expert at being bad at things.
In that case, the Strong Dragon was so. You need to write another one.
I'll work on it. I'm busy. I'm busy having a tentacled creature climb up a piece of rope, and the kids trying to free the rope at the moment.
Oh, that sounds like
I
fun.
like it already.
I mean, you've only been at #1 for 3 weeks, so I don't know that you've really met the achievement goal here. I mean,
Yeah.
so you're just going to have to give in and try
Don't give him
again.
compliments. Don't give him compliments.
So-
He's got to write another one.
Yeah.
There is no
Yeah,
sarcasm up here.
I often feel that authors are a bit like dealing with cast iron pots. You know, besides the fact that we're pretty battered and been in the fire too often, you have to be fairly hard and fairly robust about criticism and things like that.
Yes.
On the other hand, they tend to be very fragile when dropped.
Yes.
If you're going to fling me to the floor, try and choose a soft floor.
Well, if you insist.
Dave, I would like to go back to something that you and I were talking about in our original message chat.
Yeah.
You talked about it being harder to write a good short story than it is to write a novel. And I think I know what you meant by that, but I'd just like for you to expand on that if you would.
Well, yes, right. Let me try and start by saying the shorter something is, the less space you have to convey what you're trying to do. Anyone who's tried to write a reasonable summary of a complex book will understand exactly what I mean. You just eventually have to leave some parts out, which you really can't afford to do in conveying a good story. That means that every word has to work multiple times as hard as it would in a long and wandering tome. I feel, in fact, that the hardest thing to write, and it's quite out of fashion, is poetry. Yeah, this is the guy, you know, who's at home diving into the sea and going 30 feet down into caves after spiny lobster and possibly never coming out and things like that. He likes poetry, particularly Kipling, which has been fundamental to a lot of my philosophy over the years. But yeah, that makes it even harder because you have to confine yourself to a rhythm and structure pattern as well. I'm not brilliant enough to do that. I think a lot of poets aren't brilliant enough to do that, and that might be why poetry has kind of fallen out of favor a lot. But I think the next step is the short story. Now, if you look at the golden age of science fiction, almost all of those writers got their start in writing short fiction. It was not only a great way of training them, it was a great way of getting the public to taste their work. And, you know, with you guys writing short stories, I have some hope that at least for some of your regular contributors, that this could be exactly that. You know, oh, Cedar Sanderson story. Oh, she's written a book. Oh, I've got to read that. You know, whereas otherwise they might just never come across you, because that is the biggest problem with authors these days, is just achieving some form of visibility.
Yeah.
There are so many books out there, and I'm enormously grateful to the fact that we can now self-publish and go indie. but it does mean that there is, to some extent, a big slush pile out there, and people have to find you. Now, an anthology serves the function of already condensing that down to books that somebody has curated. Now, how good that anthology is will depend on the taste of the editor. And I think you guys have so far done a pretty good job of choosing editors. You failed in a forthcoming book, but you can't
I
you
think,
can't have it all your own way.
well,
Yeah.
and that brings us to, you will be doing the selection editor for our upcoming Mad Science anthology.
Yeah.
And
And as you can tell, I'm working on the whole mad scientist thing. I haven't quite got my own island with a volcano yet. At least I'm on the island. That's
every
what I would-
anthology is shaped by the editor. So what you select is going to be a very Dave flavored anthology, and it should be really interesting and probably a little fishy.
I was going to say it should make people laugh at occasional points too, because I'm a very serious individual, which I cope with by making silly jokes all the time. That's kind of the nature of the animal.
You also made
Sorry?
you also made a comment about the reason you quit being an ichthyologist was the spelling was so hard. I mean, how hard is it to spell fish? Fish.
Depends on how many strange letters and characters you use. You could start with a PH to start with. Yeah, I've seen an interesting spelling of fish, which took about 15 characters to get through. But ichthyologists, especially the taxonomy side, took this all as a challenge and sort of I'd see how long they could make the names of fish. And there's kind of rule that says if a fish is particularly tiny, particularly irrelevant, and probably would otherwise have nothing going for it, you should try and give it as long a name as possible, so it feels it's got something.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
I spent some time working on a species called Pseudocrenulabris philander, which was about 1.5 inches long. The only relevant part of the whole name was the philander part, because I was working on sex selection within them. They're a form of cichlid, and cichlids are quite interesting because they the male rears the brood in his mouth. The eggs get hatched inside the male's mouth, and he will spit them out and let them feed and then take them back in if there's danger, which is kind of a great way of shocking people. Look, he's eating all the babies.
And of course, that's the attitude some people would take.
But it's still, I mean, you don't necessarily think, or most people don't think of fish as being good parents, but the cichlids really are.
Well, there's a selective advantage to being good parents if there's a high probability of your offspring getting eaten up by something else. And there's a point at which endless sowing of wild oats, which is quite common and among the various fish species and invertebrates, in fact, is a diminishing return. But I thought of writing a book many years ago, which would be called Wild Sex, which involved all the strangest ways of reproduction.
Oh, goodness.
Biologists.
Yes.
Oh dear.
And
That would,
everyone
yeah,
said,
that would be.
"Please do this because this would be an oh John Ringo no moment."
Oh my.
Um,
But the good parenting is part of what we asked for with the boys' books. And
yeah.
I mean,
You do struggle with a very big conundrum there, because a good parent will probably try and stop his kids or her kids having quite the sort of adventures that make good stories. So one of the interesting things I went and, because I'm an obsessive researcher, went and researched a whole lot of the books that fitted into my idea of good boys story books. And so many of them have great parents, but the parent isn't there for some reason which is acceptable both to the reader and to the parents of the reader.
yeah,
You know, take the Arthur Ransoms where daddy is off as a naval officer. He can't be there. And yeah, so yeah, it's a tricky line to walk because
it is.
so many of the modern books, you kind of think, well, where were their parents and letting them get into this sort of mess? Or the authors kill off their parents, which I kind of think is a bit
It's
of a
late.
cop-out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, I thought it was quite important to reflect the characters of the kids or the reactions of the kids to their parents' characters. I mean, Podge is freaked out by that whole idea that he would have to take family responsibility because he's actually been in that role.
Yeah.
You know, whereas Scoot hasn't.
Mhm.
So he's quite casual about it, which once again I've actually seen this in real life with kids. One of the things about writing is you have to. It's no use being a talker, so I don't know why you guys are getting me to talk. I should be listening to you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
so say something.
okay. I have a comment about Scott. The
Yeah.
fact that he is a doer rather than a waiter. He tends to react to the situation immediately, do something, right or wrong, he's going to do something.
Yep.
Because he's a farmer. That's the way he's trained.
And it also just seems instinctive with some people to
Yes.
immediately jump in and do things. I'm afraid I'm one of the kind that in disasters immediately tells other people what to do, which you know has its uses.
Well, you have the experience too. Other
Well,
people don't.
You know, I found it. I am one of the volunteer ambulance guys, and we've been on a couple of disaster type scenes where there've been a bunch of people, and I think it's the army. You know, I was an NCO,
Yeah.
and I just started yelling at people, and suddenly I thought, "You're not the most senior medic here." Bloody place, and you know, let somebody else do it, but they weren't, so I did.
Yeah.
You were talking about the having to have the parents somewhat absent.
Yeah.
I grew up in West and Central Africa in the 70s. My father was an oil engineer. It was dad was always in the office and mom had social functions. So Chris and I were basically rampaging around the bush for hours of the day with no parents anywhere in sight.
And I often felt if my parents had the least idea what I was doing, they might have had more of a reaction. But when I got older, I discovered that, in fact, what they were hiding from me was their own misspent youth.
Yeah.
My mother and father actively aided and abetted some of our more spectacular episodes.
Well,
Yeah. I
Dad
can-
and I went camping at 50 below zero in Alaska because Dad wanted me to have the experience of having been winter camping under extreme conditions in a canvas tent, a Baker half. And so I think parents sometimes want their children to skirt the edges of.
My mother taught a 10-year-old how to make highly volatile explosives.
Doesn't most mothers do that?
Isn't it normal behavior?
Yeah. Well, and Rick raises a good point too in the chat. Free range children, the scout troop.
Yeah.
That's basically what you have when you take the scouts out, because you can only watch one of them at a time, and the other 32 are gone. You just hope to round them all back up and get the same head count you started with.
And preferably all the pieces still attached.
No arterial bleeding.
Well, yeah, pieces attached are not necessarily required. At least they weren't in my scout troop.
We didn't have a scout troop. Chris and I had tutors for most of the time we were in Africa. We'd have an older colonial gentleman teaching us what gentlemen should know. And then we went out and disappeared till dark.
I think there's some vague similarity there in that I was often told to not come back until the lights went on, and to be back when the lights went on.
Yes.
And we were lucky enough to grow up next to what eventually became a nature conservation area. At that stage was just bush.
Yeah.
It's the bush.
It ran from the ridgeline, which was about a mile back from the sea, all the way down to the sea. So I could sneak along through the bush and all the way down to the sea, which once again I'd been told very firmly that I was not to go swimming in on my own.
So the first thing you did?
Never. How can you do that? I took the dog.
Well, the question is, did the dog make it back?
It was a Labrador, so it was lucky it did, because it liked being in the water.
Yes.
Yeah.
My father had this lovely hand-drawn map in his office at the company, and it was a map of the area, and the big green part, miles and miles of green part, was MMBA. So I spent years as a child telling visitors that it was the Imba forest. And I found out later it was miles and miles of bloody Africa.
Recognize this.
I thought you might.
Yeah, I think we, and I think I'm older than both of y'all. I think we all grew up allowed to go out and experience things.
I wasn't allowed. I was thrown out of the house, told not to come back.
Well, I was kind of polite, but yes, we all were thrown out of the house.
And I'm of a slightly different generation, but my parents deliberately lived places where they could throw me out of the house and have me not come back until dark. And I wasn't hanging around with random other people because there weren't other people.
And your husband's taking a cheap shot at you.
Yes, well, I mean.
Well,
but the difference today, if you let a child do what we did growing up,
oh God,
Child Protective Services would take the child and you would be in jail.
Well, we were Nigeria and parts of South Central Africa that were English colonial. And my mother and the other ladies of her class got to do social things, and children were expected to either be very clean and quiet in the corner or gone.
Yeah.
Children were born to be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very quiet in the corner.
I was sent off when I was 13 to a school which had been founded for the children of officers and gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in a place called Bloemfontein, which was in the middle of South Africa and was about as Afrikaans as you could possibly be, with the end result that the school was as militantly English as it could possibly be. If you've ever read Storky and Co., that's was my growing up, was a school just like that. And the strange thing is that my dad was 50 years old when I was born, and in many ways the world had changed very much between generations. But the one thing we had in common was that school, which hadn't changed very much in that.
Yeah.
Everything was run by the bell. The bell was a big piece of railway iron, which the junior kids all got, the first year of high school kids all had a roster in which we had to ring the various rings, and they were beat out on these bells, and you had to know exactly what happened with the bell, and if you didn't, you found yourself meeting the cane. And I must say, I have a very different attitude to corporal punishment as to what is fashionable now, because
Yes.
you soon become completely inured to it, and it's one of those facts of life. You don't particularly want it to happen, but
Yeah.
if it didn't happen, you probably were being abnormal.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, you talk about seen but not heard. I made that mistake when I was about 7 years old. We lived out in the country in Louisiana. Swamp on one side, railroad tracks on the other side. And I had a pet banded king snake, which, if you've never seen one, looks exactly like a coral snake, except the colors are reversed.
I saw a picture just the other day. Yes, it's sort of red and black and
Yellow.
Is it yellow?
Yes.
Black, yellow, and red.
Red touching yellow, chosen fellow. Red touching black, friend of Jack.
Yeah. So I go in with it wrapped around my arm when my mother was hosting a garden club event. Somebody screamed. I dropped the snake. It went under the couch. The women bolted. And I'm scrabbling trying to find the snake.
Put my snake back.
And my mother was grabbing me by the seat of my pants and picking me up. And I got switched that night. And my mother never again hosted a garden club.
Well, she might have tried, but she probably wouldn't have got many takers after that.
No. But what Mike said about Okinawa and Habus reminded me of that. We tend to do just exactly the opposite of what we're told. And that was kind of our mantra as kids. Yeah, Rick, it was a win for her too.
Yeah, I actually find grandparents are a big problem in these things, because I was trying to raise my kids to, not stick their necks out quite as far as I had.
Good luck.
Yeah, I didn't have much luck. But as they partly tended to use their parents as role models, I didn't tell them about my misadventures as a youth. And then they would go off to their grandmother and she'd say, "Oh, David always used to do that."
Well, the other advantage that we have, Dave, is they didn't have cell phones back when we were kids. Thank God for small favors.
No cameras.
Very few cameras.
I must admit, with several, being a rock climber, and often things go wrong without actually being disasters. There have been a lot of times when it would have been really nice to be able to have that phone and say, "Okay, guys, don't get out the search party. We're just, stuck." Or really, we aren't lost. We're just 20 k's further than we thought we were.
We're not lost. We just don't know where the hell we are
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, my kids both took to climbing and diving, and it's been a source of stress to me because I actually know what they're doing, whereas my parents, never having done either,
Yeah.
had absolutely no idea quite what I was doing when I was doing those things. My dad grew up in Basutoland, which probably had a lot of similarities with Ian's background,
Yeah.
in that he was at a trading store, which was 60 miles from the nearest other white person.
Uh-huh.
And he used to have to ride off to school as a little kid. He and the horseboy would ride off together, and the horseboy would then eventually come back with the horse. And then at the end of the week, the horseboy would have ridden down, and the two of them would ride back again. But he'd never learned to swim because it's a mountain place,
Yeah.
and even it's got lots of rivers, but they're not particularly deep. So he absolutely loved the sea, and his boys both jumped into it. So yeah, he had no idea what he was sending us into, which was really well for both of us.
Yeah, you gotta admit, Dave, it's a little different to see somebody who's a rock climber who's also a diver. Those are usually mutually exclusive.
Why? They're both adrenaline sports.
Well, most of the rock climbers that I'm aware of tend to go to higher altitudes and tend to gravitate toward mountains.
No, they gravitate down from a mountain.
Yeah.
Really? Promise you they gravitate down. I actually spent a lot of my time on sea cliffs. So the distance between them was not particularly great. I'm a rock climber rather than a mountaineer. I've, quite happy to walk up mountains. Well, so long as I'm not carrying too much. But a cliff at sea level is a cliff, and I don't mind so long as it's a cliff.
Yeah.
And it's no more comfortable to fall from a height into water than onto other things.
No.
There's
Water is not compressible.
Well, there's quite a lot of it's become quite fashionable, and my son and daughter-in-law are very keen on it, to do what they call deep water soloing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's deep water underneath them when they fall off. So provided it's not too high,
Right.
I suppose,
Right.
You will presumably fall in, swear an awful lot because your boots are wet, and otherwise, at least you're alive. Falling onto the crash mats. They do a fair amount of bouldering, which is not usually that high, maybe 15, 16 feet, which is still quite a fall. And you have someone to try and make sure that instead of landing on your head, which is the natural way of doing things and what God intended, you'll land on your feet, which then ends up with broken ankles and delightful things like that instead. But the deep water soloing has become quite popular, but I've never really figured out quite what you do after you've fallen off, because I don't know if you guys have ever come across rock climbing boots. They are intended for high friction. They're not intended to get wet, and you buy them by buying boots which are 2 sizes too small.
Yep.
So you will often see people literally just about crying in pain trying to get their feet into them. If your toenails are too long, You can't, because obviously you want your foot as close to the natural edge of the boot as possible. So it's got to be as tight as possible. And
Yes.
typically you'll see the guy get to the top, or climber get to the top of the thing, and they'll say, "Off belay, taking my boots off," because never mind bring anybody else off, the
Yeah.
pain has to stop. The reason that you kept climbing was not for the sheer joy of being out there and climbing this magnificent mountain or piece of cliff. It was so that you could get to a place that you could take your boots off.
And hopefully not blood out of them.
Oof.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a few interesting adventures doing that at times. The best rock climbing story I can tell, which Ian will probably appreciate, was climbing on a cliff which was quite popular. So often bits of rock climbing gear would be left on it.
Mhm.
And getting through an incredibly hard bit. It was called Old Man's Climb, and it was designed for old people who actually knew what they were doing instead of young fools like me. And I got through the hardest part, reached the ledge, and I could see a peg, and somebody, thank God, had left a sling there that I could clip into. So I grabbed my carabiner, it's a snap link basically,
Yeah.
and tried to clip into this thing, and it went slither, slither, slither off the ledge. At which point I acquired such terrific strength that I didn't actually stop and clip into the peg. It was either go screaming past or go screaming down, and at that stage, down was quite a long way. So
Yes.
Yeah.
Down was contraindicated.
yeah,
Let's go back to talking about writing. You've written in a number of different genres. What would you consider your favorite genre?
probably space opera, but each one of them has its own charm in different ways. I think space opera has almost a nostalgia factor for me. I have a bad habit of making the science try and work, especially the biology.
Yeah.
So at least when I'm dealing with something like the Schmidt's universe, I know I don't have to actually make the science work, which is quite a relief. But I think all of them extend you as a writer. I think I've learned things from writing romance bits, for instance, that I would never have dreamed of learning if I'd stuck, say, to hard science fiction. And those skills and some of the writing, in fact, then transfers over. Genres tend to have almost a language of their own. And that's why
yes.
when people move very rapidly into a genre they don't know, they often make a complete mess of it and write it just like whatever genre they usually write in. This can have the side effect of making them popular with people from the genre they used to write in, but not particularly popular with people who normally read books in that genre. I mean, for instance, most science fiction people would automatically know what you meant by FTL. Most romance writers would think you were probably referring to something quite odd.
Oh dear.
Okay.
Oh dear.
Well, I always said this was not for children. So
And that's the thing too, which is, and I know we've talked about this on the Mad Genius Club about writers who will proudly say that they've never read books in the genre they're attempting to write in. and it's a mistake because you need to know the reader expectations.
Mm. Well, there's another thing that struck me. It's a number of people who've come up to me and said, I'm writing a novel. And I'll say, oh, yeah, what do you read? Well, I don't read.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've come across them as well. You know, or I don't read much except, such and such. But I'm now trying to write a science fiction novel. And I think, well, you're lost before you start, because the best, I started writing in a way because in the 80s particularly, I started finding it really hard to find books that I liked.
Mhm.
And I mean, the authors that I particularly looked up to, Heinlein, Niven, Schmitz, so on. Many of them had this bad habit of being dead.
Yeah. Minor problem.
Had slowed down their production quite seriously. I mean, really, what we really need, and you might give this hint to your short story writers, is an Ouija keyboard, so that at least we can get dead writers to go on. But yeah, so I always feel that writers are a subset of readers, and if you're not getting writers of, let's say, as we've talked about too on MGC, if you're not getting male writers, or if you're not getting, I don't know, writers from New Zealand or
Yeah.
whatever, that means people there aren't reading.
Yes.
At one stage, yes, there was this big filtering effect, because publishers would only take from a particular political ideology, and you had to match their criteria, which has had a disastrous effect on their sales.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
why you've still got big publishing houses whose legacy authors, for want of another word, are literally keeping them afloat. They're producing these
Yeah.
slews of other new writers who get 2 or 3 books, never really catch fire, and disappear. Yeah, they're selecting from such a tiny pool, and to be a writer that actually can write for an audience who is not like you is quite a trick, and not that many authors manage it. As I'm not particularly like anyone, I find this very difficult. I find the lack of beards in America quite distressing. I thought you guys were all like ZZ Top.
I shaved mine a couple of months ago. But you make a good point, Dave. When I switched from writing basically urban fiction / Western to writing science fiction, I lost about half my readership because they didn't care for science fiction. But I picked up some readers in the science fiction world. But to try to get those Western readers back, I've gone back and I'm now writing an 1870s Western series.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a Louis L'Amour fan for generations, but I must admit, I've always thought that was the one genre I probably wouldn't write, simply because I don't know the country and don't know the background well enough to
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's one thing that's for certain: he certainly did know his places and
Yes.
people very well.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
You know, I could write the same thing about South Africa or even possibly Australia, but yeah, I simply read those and think, yeah, I wish I could write that, but I can't.
Well, it would be a different kind of Western.
Because there was the
science fiction Western, perhaps, but Western, no, I don't think so. I think you guys have got the market there.
But there was the equivalent era in Australia and I don't know much about the history of South Africa, but I would
Oh, yeah.
assume that there was something there as well, because I think the resonance of the Western is more about competent men doing things.
Yeah.
And because and that's what we've been looking at as Raconteur Press, is trying to come up with men's adventure books, because that we want to see more men reading. We want to see the boys reading, and then give all of them something to think about and something to enjoy. And having, like, the Louis L'Amour characters, that's the common thread, is that they are men who do what needs to be done.
Well, and Rick makes a good point in the chat. Out on the frontier, wherever that may be, you don't have much infrastructure, and the law was days or counties away. So you could write that in South Africa, in Australia. Hell, you can write it today in Australia.
I was going to say, I think incompetence actually often leads to more interesting stories. And that actually even crops up in the Louis L'Amours.
Yeah.
Not
Yes.
that often, but it is there in several of them, where the guy has to learn his competence along the way. And
Which
whole-
is a good thing to do for a plot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also been the ones where the guy had the attitude that his civilized way of life was far better than the wild and woolly and lawless outback, or sorry, Western style of life. It's one of the things I've found hardest to deal with about Australia, is that we tended to all have a Crocodile Dundee idea of Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just shorthand. But Australia is extremely urban.
Yes.
Around
I
the
think-
coast, yes.
Exactly. And I think it's something like 80% or 90% of the population live in 5 cities around the coast.
Yes.
And the rural Australians are not that wildly different to the Crocodile Dundee image at times.
Yep.
Admittedly, I carefully chose the bit that didn't have crocodiles.
Wise.
Oh,
well,
you talk about irrational fear, and that is the one animal that just looking at it made me scared.
I don't think that's irrational.
No, but I'm rationally scared of a lot of things. That one, I didn't have to think about or anything like that. I was just scared of it. And the one fish farm I worked on was smack bang in the crocodile area. And we were emptying one of the dams, taking all the little fingerlings out. They're catfish, so they air breathe.
Yeah.
So what we do is let most of the water out and then go and scoop the fish out of the shallow little puddle that remained. And the shallow little puddle that remained didn't have an awful lot of fish in, for the simple reason that it was populated by crocodile. And all the guys I was supposed to be clearing the dam with, local heady people, took off in every direction imaginable, with suitable vocal comments, like because they didn't like crocodiles any more than I did. But there I was, left with a crocodile in a puddle, and there was no way that anybody was coming back near it. And it was only about a yard and a half, maybe a little bit longer. So it wasn't a huge one, but still enough to give you quite a bite.
Yeah.
And I had to deal with it, and I really didn't enjoy it. So I think that was a good reason to move as far from them as possible. I put a bucket over its mouth, because once I stopped being irrational about it, I did know that their muscles, pretty much like shark jaw muscles, are very effective at biting and incredibly weak at opening. So if you can trap the mouth closed,
Yep.
they can't, I mean, you can literally hold their mouths closed with one hand. But the force coming down will cheerfully bite the hand off.
Yes.
Yeah, 2,000 pounds per square inch.
Yeah. So yeah, I dropped a bucket over its head, stood on the bucket, so it was trapping the mouth down, and then grabbed the tail and between the front legs and kind of yelled frantically for someone to grab me some rope, which was thrown at me. And then I had the interesting situation of, all right, how do you hold something and tie it all on your
Very
own?
carefully.
Anyway,
My
we managed to get it out alive.
My father's solution to crocodiles, he didn't like them any more than you did. My father's solution involved tens of pounds of gelignite.
I would have really loved I would have, in fact, loved a firearm of any sort, and I would have sat quite a long way away and shot it. But as I was at the time getting very wet, because this is very tropical, and it was fairly pointless wearing anything. I mean, waders, you would have just been as sweaty inside them as you were.
Right.
You'd probably have been sweatier in them than you would have been just getting wet. Yeah, I had nothing of any description with me except a bucket, which is not my chosen weapon. Yeah, I did discover one other nice thing about crocodiles, though, is there was a river at the bottom of this place, and it was actually really beautiful and nice place to go for a swim. But of course, it did have the population of hippopotamuses and crocodiles. Now, hippopotamuses are really things you want to avoid.
Yes.
But they're also quite large. So long as you choose your water to be fairly shallow, so you can actually see the rocks, and the rocks are not big and hippopotamus shaped.
And moving.
You're reasonably safe from hippos. They tend to be in the big pools. And the one downside, of course, is that the crocodiles didn't in the least mind if the water was shallow. But we discovered that an electrofisher was quite effective. You suddenly had a rigid crocodile. So we tested out by putting 2 poles of electrofisher in. If only fish came up, and you stopped electrofishing, and you could jump in. If Mr. Snappy came up, you would go look for somewhere else. Yeah.
I grew up in Louisiana around gators, so they don't bother me as much as spiders do. But everybody's got their own phobias. Well, Dave, we've wasted another hour of our time and your time, especially.
Oh,
We really do appreciate.
It's been very easy talking to you lot.
Well, that's kind of scary.
Yeah. Well, we really do appreciate your getting up and talking to us. And
thank you very much, Dave.
My pleasure. The one thing that I regret is I haven't seen Ian, because I can only see 2 faces.
He'll come around.
yeah.
Hello, Dave.
He doesn't look any better right side up.
Nope.
Okay. Well, take care over there. Don't do anything I wouldn't, which gives you a fair amount of leeway.
There's some leeway there.
Yeah.
Please give my best to Barb's.
She has been laughing at me from the other room.
As one would expect.
Well, now back to the salt mines and writing.
She's got to do what she's good at, and I've got to do what I'm good at.
All right. Well, we really appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Be
Have a
safe.
good day.
Be safe, my friend.
Bye.
That was
That was lovely.
That was
That was
good.
good.
It really was.
Yes.
I hope you folks that were in the chat enjoyed it. And remember, folks, don't sweat the petty stuff. Don't pet the sweaty stuff. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Next week or Thursday?
Thursday, sorry.